Good afternoon. This is a brief conversation about the local history of Boston, Massachusetts in the 18th century through the life of Samuel Adams. Today, I will be interviewing historian Peter Drummey with the Massachusetts Historical Society. I would like Peter to introduce himself, and after that, I plan to ask 4 questions concerning the life of Samuel Adams. Welcome, Peter.
It's a pleasure to do this for you. I'm Peter Drummey, the chief historian and Stephen T. Riley librarian at the Massachusetts Historical Society.
Okay. All right, my first question is, how much was the influence of Samuel Adams' father upon his life?
Well, I should start out by saying this is sort of confusing because Samuel Adams's father is named Samuel
Samuel
Adams,
Adams.
as is his son. So
Right.
I'm going to call the father of Samuel Adams Deacon Samuel Adams,
Okay.
and the son Dr. Samuel Adams, just to distinguish the three of them. There are many Adamses in Boston at this time. So often the Samuel Adams who we're concentrating on will be confused with someone else named Adams, including his illustrious second cousin, John Adams. But in fact, Samuel Adams is born in 1722. His father is a maltster, is a malt master or maker, an ingredient in food and especially beer brewing, but very successful. Is becomes essentially a real estate investor and developer, so that a man from ordinary rank in life, born in the 17th century, is able to provide his son, his only surviving son of 12 children.
Mm.
Only 3 of Deacon Adams's children reach adulthood. So this is an aspect of this life we have to think about. He is also born into the metropolis of New England, the large urban center, but it's not very large. It's only a physically very small town with a population of maybe 12,000. In fact, it's just coming to the peak of its colonial existence. That is during Samuel Adams's lifetime, the town of Boston will decrease in importance and briefly in population. It's the time of economic decline, less prosperous place, and that plays out in Samuel Adams's own life. His father, Deacon Adams, provides him essentially with the best education you can receive in colonial America. He goes to Harvard College, founded in the 17th century, primarily founded to train ministers. And there's certainly an aspect of that. Samuel Adams is a devout Congregationalist Christian and his father may have wanted him to become a minister. He moved away from that idea, but he remained religiously devout. His religion is part of the way we think about him. Mm-hmm. He's born in the 18th century, but he's very much a representative of Puritan New England, a conservative reaction against the Old England, people who came to the Massachusetts Bay in the 17th century to escape the strictures of church and state in England. And so there's a very strong Puritan, upright component of Samuel Adams's character. Mm-hmm. I think that his connection to his father is really interesting. There's not a lot of written evidence about that connection, but in fact, about the time that Samuel Adams graduates from college, he enters college when he's very young. He's in the class of 1740 at Harvard College, so he would have entered as a young teenager, age 14, in 1736. But most students were very young at that time, young teenagers. But when he graduates from college, he is and then goes on 2 years later. This is almost an honorary degree, but he receives his master's degree as well from Harvard College. And that's not uninteresting because the world is rapidly changing at that time. And the subject of his master's degree, I'm just paraphrasing this, is essentially that it's the duty of someone to resist the authority of an unjust ruler, that
Okay.
that is part of your essentially your obligation as a subject and citizen. And you don't want to put too much evidence on this. This is an educational exercise, but it's interesting he starts out there.
Mhm. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, what do you think what had the greatest influence upon Samuel Adams' life?
I think the greatest influence, I think, because it carried through the rest of his life, is soon after he graduated from college, his father, who was a successful businessman and merchant, was involved in an attempt to essentially remove a constraint upon the economy of um, colonial Massachusetts, and that was there was very little hard money, silver and gold money, in New England, and it made it difficult to do business. So what they had in early Massachusetts Bay and in New England was lots of land. So Deacon Samuel Adams and other businessmen, merchants, um, came together and decided they would open a bank that would be backed with the value of property, land, rather than backed with currency. And this would allow the printing of paper money and circulating it. And they saw this as a way to open the economy. They were constrained both in not having gold and silver. In fact, there's a wonderful system of where they would have gold and silver coins from everywhere, not simply um, British currency, but currency in metal from all over the world. And you'd have to have an elaborate chart to tell you what shillings and pounds were worth in all other Spanish and even German and Austrian coins were circulating in America. Because this was a very serious problem. The greater problem was that in doing this, they were going outside their bounds of what colonists were allowed to do. They were subjects of Parliament and the king, but this was a colony which largely served to benefit the mother country rather than necessarily the colony itself. So people in both in England and here in America were very concerned about this paper currency circulating, and the British government intervened, and this was called a land bank because it was based upon the value of land.
Mhm.
And so the land bank was essentially suppressed, put out of business, and the investors in the land bank, including Samuel Adams's father, Deacon Adams, were essentially called upon to repay in hard currency, in gold and silver, all the debts that they had accrued
Oh, no.
in the land bank currency. This is a long introduction to this, but this was a terrible blow to Samuel Adams's father. It also, I think, influenced Samuel Adams greatly, perhaps for the remainder of his life, in that it showed that people without a voice in their own government, beyond the bounds of colonial New England,
Mhm.
were subject to arbitrary power from overseas. That
Okay.
is, they had simply ruined his father and his father's colleagues for essentially to protect the economy of the home country. And I think that idea of um, uh, representation in government, and in fact, this is not explicitly taxation, but this control of your own life and business and economy was very powerfully set when Samuel Adams is still a very young man. And in fact, his father was, the family lost their substantial wealth. His father was fighting bankruptcy the rest of his life. The father lived on until 1748. But the first years of Samuel Adams's life as an adult were spent in aiding in the defense of the family property against all of these creditors. So that, I think, very powerfully shaped his view of where colonists were in relationship to government. And I think made his distrust of a powerful government at a distance with no say in it very strong, not from birth, not from his thesis at Harvard, but very powerful. And I think he saw the world through that lens essentially for the rest of his life,
Hmm.
including into the early national period of the United States.
Okay, thank you. Uh, okay, the next question is, in the archives of the New York Public Library is a copy of the first correspondence meeting in 1772. My question is, how was Samuel Adams able to encourage these men to meet with him?
Well, this is a little bit different. Oh, I'm not correcting you, but just adding a little bit
Okay.
more detail.
No, I'm
There
here
were
to learn. I would love to
Yes, that's right. There
learn.
were committees of correspondence going back into the 1760s. That is, different colonies wrote to other colonies,
Okay.
especially about the Stamp Act crisis in the middle of the 1760s, and certainly in when British troops. I got to be careful here because everyone is British. They're colonists. They thought of themselves as subject of the king. They
Right.
weren't proto-revolutionaries yet, but nevertheless, troops were sent to Boston to essentially enforce the laws passed in Great Britain, taxation in the 1760s, the end of the 1760s. This led up to the Boston Massacre in
Hmm.
1770. But what Samuel Adams was involved in is starting in 1772, after the tumult brought about by the Boston Massacre, to sort of organize in Massachusetts the Boston Committee of Correspondence. But the Boston Committee of Correspondence was formed to communicate with, because Maine was then part of Massachusetts, there were perhaps 250 or 300 separate towns throughout Massachusetts and Maine. So the Committee of Correspondence was to inform people living everywhere else except Boston about what was happening here. And Boston was the main entry port into New England and what
Hmm.
was happening in other colonies. And also, with that information, which largely revolved around oppression by the royal government, to spread that idea of resistance and protest throughout Massachusetts rather than focusing it um, only in Boston. Boston didn't have the power to stand alone, but Boston united with the countryside and people living in Maine and other larger towns were a much more powerful force. 12 or 15,000 becomes hundreds of thousands of people, theoretically. It also, the committees of correspondence were very useful in sending news to other colonies and receiving news and reaction from other colonies. So this may be, in fact, it's early in the story of the revolution, the coming of the revolution, but that may have been Samuel Adams's finest hour. The most important thing he did was be the organizing force behind the committees of correspondence, first in Boston, then in Massachusetts, then throughout the colonies.
Mhm.
Other colonies adopted the same practice. And they were both, writing to each other, a form of communication, but to some extent, they also acted as sort of vigilance committees. That is, when they received news about people importing during times, they didn't have to use the word boycott, but essentially that's what we're talking about. When people were escaping the organized resistance, people could consult with them. This was in fact sort of spreading this idea of resistance to royal authority or the authority of Parliament throughout, again, first Massachusetts and essentially colonial America. People elsewhere were finding out what was happening here. When, after the Boston Tea Party, the royal government closed the port of Boston, essentially put everybody involved in maritime trades out of work, reduced the population of Boston, essentially to poverty, if not starvation.
Mm.
It was the committees of correspondence that acted powerfully to bring aid to Boston, not just from elsewhere in Massachusetts, but from everywhere. And that was this idea that people elsewhere had a stake in what happened here.
Okay.
And even people who disapproved of the destruction of the tea, which is what they called the Boston Tea
Mhm.
Party,
Mhm.
would nevertheless think this reaction to it by the British government was um, out of proportion to the monetary loss of the destruction of the tea. So that's sort of, again, that's really important in Samuel Adams's life, a life full of important works. I will argue that much later there's something that I think is really important too. But go on with your question.
Okay. Um, Given time, I'm gonna go to the next question and then we'll
Sure.
talk another time maybe. Okay. What was Samuel Adams' greatest accomplishment? I think you might have answered that and you
I've,
felt,
I've answered it in half, and I'll only briefly
yeah.
add something really quite different, but
Okay.
really important, and that is go through the revolution and his work for 8 years in the Continental Congress through the revolution, his return to state office holding in Massachusetts. In 1787, news came from Philadelphia of um, uh, the convention that wrote the federal constitution. And there were ratifying conventions in all of the states. And the one here in Massachusetts was very important. Massachusetts was large in population, important in the history of the Revolution. So the ratifying convention here, which took place in early in 1788, was really important, what the decision of Massachusetts was. And Samuel Adams, respected citizen of Boston, revolutionary, was a member of that convention. Now, uh, Adams did not belong to a political party, but I think he was understood to have strong reservations about the federal constitution.
Mhm.
And during the course of the ratifying convention here in Massachusetts, here in Boston, where hundreds of people, delegates came from the rest of Massachusetts and Maine here, including many people who had been part of essentially an urban rebellion only the year before, Shays' Rebellion, when the countryside rose up and resisted the taxes imposed by the state. Anyways, Samuel Adams was convinced to, in fact, vote for ratification. It was a very close thing, and don't hold me to this number, but I believe it was 187 delegates for and 168 delegates against. In fact, there was a time just before the vote when they adjourned the convention, so I think some arms could be twisted, and some figures, including famously John Hancock, but also, even perhaps more important, Samuel Adams was convinced that, in spite of his reservations, which were mostly because there's no original Bill of Rights in the federal Constitution. There's no protection of individual liberties. This is going to be a national government at a distance. Um, People being elected, like the Senate or presidency, for even the House of Representatives by Massachusetts standards for long terms of service. It's kind of, I think to him, it would have sounded more like the royal government that he had so long fought against. But in fact, you can't prove this, but it's very hard to think that when he came out as supporting it with the idea that there would be amendments to it, including essentially a Bill of Rights, that was part of the recommendation that went along with the ratification. That was made, it wasn't as he lived on for another 15, 16 years thereafter, but just like 1772, I think 1788 was another remarkable moment in his long political career.
Wonderful. Oh, Peter, I really appreciate your time and your expertise. And I hope to someday meet you in person.
Me too. Yeah, come and we'll show you some wonderful things.
I would love
And
that.
the other thing is for this, I ran on there. So if there's anything that's hard to transcribe or
You
make
know what I'm
sense
going
of,
to do? What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off the recording now and then
sure.
we'll chat. Okay.
Yeah.
Try to find.